My name is Mark Florence. I'm the co-chairman of the Energy and Utilities Committee at BritCham here in Singapore, where we just concluded a very interesting session as part of the Singapore International Energy Week, or SUE, where BritCham had a series of events, or a series of panels, I should say, and covered various topics. We just had a discussion around the energy transition and scaling of investments in Southeast Asian infrastructure in the last of the series. This one, we're talking about developing a hydrogen economy in CCUS, which I personally believe is a key part of the whole road to net zero. I think without it, we would be struggling. And I'm going to turn across to both Peter Godfrey, who is the Managing Director for APAC, the Energy Institute, and to Thomas Briault, who is the head of the Energy Charter for Arup here in Singapore. So I'll start with, and both of you are in the panel. Thomas, you chaired it. Perhaps I'll start with you, Thomas, because you chaired it, and just get your key takeaways from that discussion.
Yeah, thanks. So I guess there was some interesting takeaways, and one thing actually came from the previous panel, which Allard chaired, kind of looking at the investment opportunity of hydrogen and seeing the big potential there. So we had Henry C. talking about the opportunities for mobility, and particularly if you think about Singapore, we're thinking aviation and shipping and bunkering, I guess. And then we had Michael Jenner from Semcor, who's looking at carbon capture and storage project in the UK. Very interesting opportunity, and I think that is something that the big oil and gas companies can really get their teeth into in terms of a transition for their upstream, downstream and midstream businesses. And then finally, we had Gareth Williams really talking about creating an overall framework and policy for the hydrogen economy, and the need to create some regulatory certainty and a requirement really on all the governments not to flip-flop on policy. So yeah, I think those were the key takeaways from my perspective.
And Peter?
Yeah, well, I'd agree very much with Thomas, and Thomas very well facilitated and moderated session. What I'd like to start with is actually the comments that Simon Wilde from Ofgem, the electricity generator from the UK, started off with, which I think ties into your point, Thomas, around the whole issue of upstream and downstream and how the oil companies can transition. Simon actually said that gas, and I quote him, "Gas is now our predominant energy resource, but this is incompatible with the zero ambition of the UK electricity sector to be net zero by 2035 without CCS, hydrogen development, and long duration storage deployment complementing renewables," those three things. And I think that's a critical element for us here in ASEAN to take on board. This is the UK saying it's not goodbye to oil and gas. There is a need to continue with gas, at least in the medium term, but to do so, CCS, hydrogen, and long duration storage are all going to be very key components of that. So to me, that was a core takeaway and a core headline for us all to consider. And that ties into his second point, which really ties into what you were saying, Thomas, about upstream, midstream, downstream, which is the need for system integration. The need particularly for the downstream side of the business to integrate more globally and fully, which is obviously illustrated in the UK by these development hubs, okay, and the need for different parts of industry to cooperate in order to minimize carbon and create the wherewithal to capture carbon and dispose of it at economic prices, and within an economic model that can work. And to me, that also tied into the conversation that we were having around development, the need that many of the industrial centres of the UK, for example, in the northeast and the northwest, and I would argue as well in Scotland, given the fact that I obviously represent a Scottish CCS project as well, need to redevelop their resources, need to redevelop their industries in a more integrated way in order to create the opportunities for that hydrogen carbon capture, long duration storage deployment to take effect and be economically deployed going forward. So to me, that was clearly the key highlight and a clear headline from the session that we have just heard.
Yeah, and it's interesting you mention, the UK's reliance on gas and it being their main energy source. I mean, it's even more extreme here in Singapore, as you know. 95% of electricity is generated from gas, and Singapore needs to import its energy given, and in a zero carbon future, given its very limited renewable energy resource locally. And whether that means, interconnectors, whether that means hydrogen, or whether that means import of natural gas and conversion into low carbon hydrogen, blue hydrogen, and the export of CO2. But I think what's clear there is that all three of those elements will need to play a role in that. And I think that was highlighted, that need for integration, as you say, was really highlighted by Gareth and some of the work that the catapults are doing.
Yeah, agreed. And I think what I would add to that, Thomas, is Henry's comments around infrastructure and the need that, we talk about hydrogen as a product, but actually what is also critical is that you're going to need to create some form of integrated infrastructure enable the hydrogen to work. And that infrastructure is not going to be investable necessarily in the whole of a particular region or a country. So the need to localize, the need to regionalize, the need to actually create that sort of integrated energy system model is absolutely core and fundamental to get this moving forwards. And I, again, as you say, parallel this to where Singapore is as effectively an importer of energy and how it is going to relate itself to, the other side of the infrastructure, if you like, the upstream side, the production side of wherever that product is coming from, whether it be Australia or Malaysia or wherever. Yeah, so that's going to be critical.
Yeah, and I don't think, particularly for Singapore, but I also think for the whole of the ASEAN region, it's not a question of if hydrogen, it's a case of when. And so creating that early market certainty here in Singapore and then for the other ASEAN countries is really important for governments and regulatory authorities to think about how they achieve that. It's not economic to collect refuse, waste from people, but we value waste collection sufficiently for health benefits to raise taxes to collect waste, and the same now needs to apply for CO2.
Yeah, and Gareth came up, and again, I'll quote, saying there is a need to determine architecture, by which he basically meant that actually, how do you do any of this unless you actually get regulators and get government to say, this is the kind of model we want to build, this is the kind of system that we need, now go ahead and develop it. So at the end of the day, what we need to do is to try and find ways to create those issues and ways of working. But there was a yes, but as well, which is to say, in order to create that architecture, there are lots of cogs and lots of wheels, and we haven't defined all of those cogs and wheels yet. So what we actually need to do is to be much more critical in the way we determine how that integrated architecture will work in the future.
Can I jump in and ask you a question, Peter? Obviously, I think, as Thomas said, hydrogen is going to be an important part of the energy mix going forward. But there was discussion in SU earlier this week about CCUS and particularly CCUS in Southeast Asia. What do you think the potential is for that?
Well, I think personally that the potential is already being developed. So back to gas, we are already seeing Malaysia announcing their first major CCS project development in Kasawari, which is offshore Sarawak. And basically it's defined around enhanced gas recovery, so that the economics for that is really about zeroing the carbon as much as they can from production of the gas, recognizing that gas is still needed as an energy product in this region. So to me, inevitably, enhanced gas recovery will be the kickoff process for CCS. And in my view, given international multilateral support, that is going to happen quicker than anybody thinks. But again, there is a yes, but, and that comes back now to the downstream side of this, which is it's all good and well decarbonizing the oil and gas business, but what we actually need to do is also think about the heavy industries onshore that need to be decarbonized. So that comes back to the discussion that we're having now, which is to say, how do you begin to start integrating the downstream side of things in a more systemic approach? So eventually what, for example, Petronas is doing in Kasawari can be linked up to what Japan or Singapore needs to do in terms of decarbonizing their industry going forwards. And that, of course, then enters into a whole set of cross-border issues and cross-border issues around the trade of carbon that still need to be sorted out. But to my mind, that's the way it's working. So CCS, I think, is already beginning to happen, but it's not yet happening from an integrated value chain perspective. And that's what we need to start encouraging the development of going forwards.
It's a topic for another day, but obviously just sucking CO2 out of the air in itself, and that's all about carbon pricing and so on. That's an interesting area as well. We won't talk about it now because that's a long discussion, but it's all happening in parallel. So it's interesting to see it progressing.
Yeah, and I think you pick on a really good point there, Mark, which is that integration that Peter talks about does come down to carbon price. Do we value it enough? There are gas wells around this region that could take waste CO2, given a right price for the for collecting it and pushing it back in there. So again, we come back to that regulatory certainty that could then provide that framework.
Totally agree.
Well, thanks to both of you. That's a very interesting session. I certainly found it interesting, and thank you for both of your participation today. Our next event in our series, our next discussion is at least around the final event, which is financing and risk revolution. Thank you.